for the house price rises. And that's got a superficial appeal to it. But if it were true, then we should find that when there's a period when there are more dwellings being built, so the actual increase in dwellings exceeds the increase in population, there should be falling house prices. So the argument cuts both ways. When you look at the data, you find that the number of people per house in Australia has been dropping from very high levels, 3.5 people per house, down to 2 people per house over the period from 1950 to about 2006. Consistently, we've been building dwellings at a faster rate than population has been growing. Now, the only way to come back and say, well, that's true, but population still rules, is to say we're wealthier now and we want larger houses with less people inside them. That has been happening, but the Americans did exactly the same thing. And what they were doing was building McMansions, palaces for the poor. And they built those palaces in the belief the palace would rise in price. That was the major motivation for doing it. And they borrowed money to do it. And the borrowed money they took out is what drove the house prices up, not the population demand. We're repeating the same process. And in fact, in an embarrassing sense, our biggest homes are now bigger than the Americans' biggest homes are, even though we're building very, very few homes. But we are still, the only time we've had an increase in population exceeding the increase in dwellings is that period from 2006 to 2010, and you analyse the data about change in population and change in house prices, the relationships are the opposite way around to the conventional argument. So it doesn't hold water.
Your home country, Australia, you said back in 2010 that Australia's property market was heading for a crash. You said prices are going to fall by up to 40%, and because of the degree to which Australians are leveraged into their property market, it's going to kill the Australian economy. Well, you're dead wrong. Australia hasn't had a recession for, what, 25 years?
And what it's done to avoid that recession is to borrow an additional 50% of GDP over the debt level it had back in 2008.
And so what, I would say, because the Australian economy is motoring at 3% growth right now. It's got unemployment of 5%, inflation rate of 1%, Australians by and large are pretty darn happy.
And so were Americans in 2007 up till July. These things come to a crunch, and the reason that isn't just a case of
But
servicing.
you said they were coming to crunch 6 years ago.
And they borrowed their way out of it.
You said, in fact, I don't mind embarrassing you. You said, I am going to walk from Canberra to Australia's highest mountain, 225 kilometres, if I'm wrong on this issue, and you were dead wrong. You had to put your walking boots on and take the hike.
The expiry of that particular bet is 2023.
Well, why did you've done the walk already?
Shut the property lobby up. It worked very effectively.
I think they felt that you were saying that the crash was coming, and that's why you felt that you had to...
As soon as you say property is going to fall over, the property lobby goes for you like a mad dog. And I went in as an academic expecting to have even academic standard debates, and they can be pretty nasty. But what the property lobby does to fight anybody who goes against their mantra is to attack on any ground.
You're the guy who told me that you were never going to appease, you were never going to tailor your message.
I didn't appease. I got up on the second page of the Sydney Morning Herald courtesy of that walk and rubbed their noses in it.
All right, well, let's talk China then. You know, if we're going round...
If you hear the case that's made by the property lobby, the conventional case is largely that population pressure is what drives house prices higher. We have a booming population, with no argument about that, and sluggish dwelling construction. Maybe, maybe not. And therefore demand exceeds supply, and that's going to drive prices up. That's a conventional case. Now mine is that money pressure is what drives house prices higher, and booming credit is what drives house prices up. And when we start getting stagnant credit, which is starting to happen right now, we'll see house prices going down. Well, let's take a look at some of the numbers behind these cases. I'm sorry, Tony, but I will use numbers here. And that is that if you look at population change versus house price change, you should find some sort of correlation if the argument's correct that population pressure is what's driving house prices up. The blue line is change in house prices, the red line is change in population. Now you might not be able to tell it, but the red line does change a bit. Rather hard to see, isn't it? There's not much variation in population there, but let's zoom in a bit and change the scale so I put population on another axis, and you can see that yes, there's a bit of change in the rate of growth of population at various times. But sometimes it's correlated with change in house prices. You look back at the 88 period, and you could make a case then that rising population is what caused the house price boom under Paul Keating. I'd blame the first-time vendors boost that he reintroduced at the time, but that's another story. Sometimes they're not correlated, and funnily enough, they're not correlated right now, which is rather strange because obviously there's been a very, very large increase in population.
but I hope you can see just by looking that there's something wrong with the correlation between house price changes and population at that time. The overall correlation is 0.21 when you measure it statistically out of a maximum value of 1, which is pretty low. There's a correlation, but it's pretty low. Now, of course, people could say, well, I'm just looking at the demand side there. I've left out the supply of housing, and surely when you look at supply of housing versus demand for housing, then the relationship will turn up. Well, let's do that. What I'm looking at here is population density. I'm looking at how many people there are per house. What's happening on that front? So here we now, the red line is now population density per house change. The blue is still popular house price change. Again, not much happening. You probably can't see it in the graph there. For most of the time, population density has actually been falling. Except for the last 4 years, housing grew faster than population, which is strange because we're normally told how sticky supply is and it doesn't respond properly. Well, you'd imagine we're building less and less houses over time, and that explains rising prices for the previous 30 years. Well, we've actually had falling density with prices rising. Let's zoom in again, take a bit closer look. Whoops, there it is. There's the red line for change in housing density. Only for that very short period has the level of housing density been rising more slowly than population. That's when we had the short time of the supply of housing being outpaced by the increase in population. So let's re-center the graph again and take a better look now. And you can see that throughout the whole period up to 2006, we've been building houses more rapidly than population's been growing. Now, if the argument about population density worked, we should have had falling prices until 2006 and rising prices since. The correlation is crazy. It's actually lower than when I just look at population. It falls to 0.1, which is pretty lousy. So there's a statistical case, there's an argument about what might be fundamentally driving it. It ain't a particularly good fundamental, but I found it amusing to have Tony saying we're going to be saying this time is different. I'm sorry, my side says this time is the same. Okay? What was the normal case, this case is different, is this just this particular period, 2006 to 2010, something different is going on here, and that justifies the recent changes in prices. Well, let's take a look and look at what's happening now. And yes, this time is different. The correlation is actually worse now between change in population per house and change in house prices. It's negative. So what you've been told is a story to explain the recent rise in prices is convincing when you think about it superficially. And if you grab those 2 years between 2006 and 2008, when they're both going in the same direction, it might look like an argument. But over that whole period, the correlation is negative. So we had rising population, meaning falling house prices. That's a bit strange. What it really means is that population pressure doesn't determine house prices. And here I'm going to be a bit paradoxical. Money pressure determines it because it's not people who buy houses. It's people with mortgages who buy houses. And that's the real pressure that's been driving house prices higher for the investing life of most people in this room, including quite a few on the table. Let's do a bit of thinking. Where do mortgages come from? Now, the conventional argument that I've been attacking, by the way, the main reason I got into this game was not to take on the property lobby. That happened by accident because I said something about house prices and they went for my jugular. I'm mainly here to take on conventional economic theory, which I think has contributed to the biggest financial crisis since the 1930s. And anybody who doesn't believe that's the case hasn't travelled often enough. Go to America and you'll find the actual unemployment rate there, recorded the way we do in Australia, which itself understates the level, is 16%. That's 1 in 6 out of a job. That's a depression. Now, a contributing factor to that has been conventional economic theory, and part of that contribution comes from how they think about where money comes from, because they say you have to save money before you can lend it. And therefore, a saver's money is lent to a borrower, and therefore they say mortgage debt in particular doesn't matter because savers can spend less, borrowers can spend more. In the aggregate, there's no overall effect. Now, if you think I'm parodying some low-grade neoclassical conventional economist, here's Nobel Prize winner Paul Krugman in his most recent paper, saying the overall level of debt makes no difference. One person's liability is another person's asset. Part of my approach is to analyse that dynamics of money, which is why I saw the crisis coming. And the impact it has on house prices, this is where I'm going to ask you to think rather hard, is that rising house prices require accelerating debt. not just rising debt, but debt rising more rapidly over time. And I'll take you through the logic. And that starts by taking the money-oriented vision I have of how capitalism functions and saying aggregate demand is income plus the change in debt. You think about your own spending, it's the sum of what you earn plus the change in debt. And that aggregates to the national level as well. So change in debt therefore plays a crucial role in driving the economy and in driving asset bubbles, and we are in one. So let's take it through step by step. And if you have anybody has a brain pain, I'll buy them a coffee afterwards. Starting from saying aggregate demand is aggregate supply plus the change in debt, I'm going to put that in symbols to make it a bit briefer. So AS for aggregate demand, aggregate supply, AD for aggregate demand, and delta there standing for change in debt. Now you spend that income and your change in debt on both goods and services and existing assets. So spreading that out, your aggregate demand will be spent on aggregate supply plus net asset sales. Now what are they? Well, net asset sales I can break down a bit and say you can break it down into three components: the price or level of assets, the fraction of the assets that are sold, and the quantity of assets that exist. So putting that in simple terms, I'm going to say NAS for net asset sales are going to be the price of assets times the fraction sold times the actual proportion that exists. Now the level of demand therefore determines the price. So what about the change in prices? That'll be determined by the change in demand. And what's the change in demand going to be? It's going to be the change in aggregate supply, GDP largely, plus the acceleration of debt. And therefore, what drives prices up is accelerating debt. You need accelerating debt to have rising house prices. Now, that's the theory. Let's see how it works out in terms of numerical correlations. What I'm using here is what I'm calling the mortgage impulse, which is the acceleration in debt, the change in mortgage debt over a year divided by GDP, and correlating that to change in house prices. I'll change the scale later to amplify the argument here. That correlation is 0.42. Now that's twice as good as a correlation as I could get over that long time period for population. So I'm starting rather better than the argument about population, and it's 4 times the density argument. And it also leads house prices. Of course, you've got to borrow money before you can buy the house. That makes sense that there should be some lead between change in debt and change in house prices, and it tends to be about 2 to 4 months. If you take a look at the correlation over time and say when's the correlation strongest, it's about 2 to 4 months ahead. Now the red line is the correlation of change in population to house prices, which is low when you take it contemporaneously and even smaller when you go in advance. It falls to 0 a few months ahead. The correlation for change in acceleration in mortgage debt hits about 0.5, about 3 to 4 months before. So if you want to know where house prices are going to go, look at what's happening to the acceleration in mortgage debt 2 to 4 months previously. And there the news doesn't look particularly good. Now I'm going to show you a more recent correlation and change the scale so you can see the degree of driving that's going on between acceleration in mortgage debt and real house price changes. And that recent boost, by the way, is caused by one of my favourite government policies, which I call the first home vendors boost, when the government gave an extra $7,000 to first home buyers to buy a new property, and they then levered it up at the bank to $100,000 more and handed it over to the vendors. That's what's really created a lot of the so-called wealth that people have made out of property. The government has been complicit in driving this asset bubble. And that turned decelerating mortgage debt, and you can see that in the chart there, back in 2008 into accelerating debt. So we sidestepped the global financial crisis, as we call it, by recreating the housing bubble. Now, of course, I keep on being told that Australia is different to America. First of all, I'm told I can't compare it, then I'm told it's different anyway. Well, that's a cute combination. Yes, it's different, apart from China, and I certainly have to acknowledge that China's had more of an impact on our economy than I gave it credit for several years ago.